Welcome back to News One Now. The Bible says Jesus had hair like lamb's wool, feet like bronze clay. But when you look all across America and the world, you swear Jesus was a blonde, blue-eyed white guy. Seen any of these movies lately? I'm telling you, Jesus, give me a shout out to Julian. Julian is darker than some of these folks who playing
all right,
Jesus.
Don't do that light-skinned thing.
No. The reason I'm doing that, because when it comes to this notion of Jesus, folks in America get real upset if Jesus is not blonde and blue-eyed. Folks, there's an author of a new book. It's called The Color of Christ, the Son of God, and the Saga of Race in America. Edward Bloom, Paul Harvey, they're the co-authors of this book. And it really, makes this thing perfectly clear. And Edward joins us right now via Skype. Edward, how you doing?
Doing really well this morning. How are you?
So this is it's an interesting topic, because when we were in the break, Juliana and I were talking, and I mentioned that we were doing this book, and she said that, and I'm gonna have her tell the story in a minute, but she talked about being in Ghana, even in Ghana. So here you are in the motherland, and all these images of Jesus Christ as this white guy, when the origins of Jesus was right there in Africa.
Yeah, we're really good at exporting things. We export Coke, we export Nike, and we export white Jesus.
So you lay out in this book how deliberate it was and how it has played a role in advancing white supremacy by taking the image of Jesus Christ, which was really for the longest, for so many years, decades, there was not even an image of Jesus for us to actually work from.
Yeah, exactly. The original founders, the British founders of the Americas, they didn't have an image of Jesus. They were Puritans. They were iconoclasts. They saw it as a violation of the Ten Commandments. But what happened in American history, at two moments, white Americans became infatuated with a white Jesus. The first moment was in the decades before the American Civil War. And you have two main things happening then. You have the number of African-American slaves rising dramatically, and you have Native Americans having their lands taken from them. And in those decades, all of a sudden, white Americans discover, they create for themselves this notion of Jesus as white. Fast forward 100 years to the early 20th century, and a group of white Americans led by the Ku Klux Klan, they discover not only that Jesus was white, but that he wasn't Jewish. And so in the early 20th century, we see the creation of a Nordic, that blonde Jesus, not just a kind of brown-haired Jewish white Jesus. So those are the kind of two main moments when white Americans refined and created this kind of white supremacist Jesus.
Also, I remember 2006, Jean-Claude Lamar did a film called The Color of the Cross. He had a black Jesus. He got death threats. Even of course on Fox News, remember this past year, Megyn Kelly, she made perfectly clear, look, Santa Claus white, Jesus white. And so it's interesting when again you see this, and even some people have been criticized. They say, wait a minute, how are you going to black churches and there's this particular image when if you actually go to the Bible and look at the region of the country where Jesus was from, you look at really how the area is developed. It's a little hard to come up with this idea of this straight-haired, blue-eyed, European-centric Jesus. What role did Michelangelo play in all of this?
So at first, very little. At first, the European painters of the Renaissance, they didn't influence British thinking, colonial thinking. That was really in the 19th century when white Americans become more refined, when they shift from being a colonial backwater to a real nation that's growing, and also with an increased number of Catholic immigrants. That's when we started seeing, a little after the American Civil War, we start seeing white Americans more interested in European artwork. But before then, the European artists, not so much.
have a question. I know growing up in my auntie's home, in my grandma's home, you will see that iconic picture of the head of Christ that was the Nordic version that you mentioned before. I'm wondering in your research what you see now with the passing of the civil rights movement, the images that people of color have now of Jesus in their homes. Do you see more people leaning towards the black Jesus, or do people still continually have this more iconic white Jesus in their homes?
Yeah, that's a great question. If you watch the film The Butler closely, there's that white Jesus in the home of the butler at first, and then his son, his more black power son, has a black Jesus in his home. And that's reflective of one change, that if you go back 40 years, many, many more African-American homes had the Warner Solomon head of Christ, the white Jesus, in their living rooms, in their homes. Now, one's far less likely to find those. So there's very few of the white Jesus images. There's some more of the more Afrocentric, maybe Rasta Jesuses. The hard part is when you go to churches, when you actually go to your church, it's expensive to change a stained glass window, right? Or you know, if you want to take out an image from your church, well, that's where I had my conversion experience, right? That's where I prayed for forgiveness. That's where I mourned the death of my dad. When we start changing those atmospheres, that's when things get a little testy.
Gotcha.
You know, I went to Ghana a few years ago and just by design attended several churches. In Ghana, which is a black African country, I did not see one black Jesus. You go to these churches, very, again, African oriented, but with a white
And the
Jesus.
whole service is very much about African culture, that experience.
But you know, the exploitation, and exportation of white supremacy came to these countries that were led by the English or the French for a very long time.
Portuguese.
And when you look at some of this, you know, basically exporting this, it's forgotten that the reason that both British and in the United States, that white Jesus was used to justify enslavement.
We're got about 20 seconds. Go ahead.
Just real quickly, visual images get taught to us before we're 3 years old, so they get internalized fast.
Well, that's one of the things that I can explain to people. And when you look at a coup anywhere in the country, they get control of the military first and the media second, because they understand if you use radio, television, newspapers, magazines, and now the internet, yeah, you can actually change the hearts and minds of people. And so it's a fascinating book. It is called The Color of Christ, the Son of God, and the Saga of Race in America. That's the cover right there. Edward J. Bloom and Paul Harvey. Edward, I really appreciate it. Thanks a lot for joining us.